How are you doing?
Oh, not too bad. We are now apparently streaming in the cloud. That's a new one for me.
I was just commenting about your map, and you just said that's not just any other map in the background. What is that map showing?
It's got a bunch of pins on it for all of the AWS regions and CloudFront edge locations, mostly because that's what I do instead of having a life.
How did you come across that hobby? Your work, maybe?
Exactly. Day to day, I solve one problem. I fix the AWS bill. There's a few things that tends to break down into, but data transfer and figuring out region arbitrage is something that tended to be entertaining. So it turned into something in a relatively short period of time where, okay, staring at bare walls is depressing and sad. So I've got that. I've got a monitor behind the camera that's showing me a near real-time list of insecure S3 buckets. It it's just really sad and depressing is the short answer.
Well, who else do we have here? Dave Palestra, how are you?
Hey, how's it going?
Good. We're here with Corey, and we're talking about the map in his background, but we're soon going to get to discussions about all kinds of things related to
Awesome.
continuous delivery and continuous integration in Kubernetes. How are
Yes, we are
you?
streaming live. Welcome. Keep yourself presentable, David.
Okay, thank you.
So tell me how you guys work together.
So Corey is one of our advisors. He goes around the country for us talking about different DevOps topics and mentions ReactiveOps.
Awesome. Okay. Well, we're going to talk about reactive ops today. Reactive ops was very helpful in the development of this latest ebook we'll be publishing in June on CI and CD in Kubernetes. And we love this topic about DevOps and how closely linked DevOps is to processes and the team structures that you see are needed to really use Kubernetes correctly. And one of the interesting aspects of this is this people issue, right? Ones people say that and you guys I think we're saying this the entire reason for doing microservices, at least is this what one of the things you learned at KubeCon. It's to solve a human management problem. And maybe this is a good place for us to start in talking about your participation in this ebook that we did, and this kind of discussion about human management problems and how they reflect, and how you adopt an application architecture in a platform like Kubernetes.
I think that's probably a fair assessment. I think the challenge is that with people with engineering backgrounds, and I consider myself one of those, tend to have a natural bias where we tend to focus on the tooling, the how. For example, there's been a 30 or 40-year war going on about VI versus Emacs, and there's still no clear winner. People still say that VI is the right answer. Other people are just professionally wrong. So there's this natural tendency to get into the how work gets done, almost to the point where it occludes what the work is. You see elements of this periodically arising these days with the microservices revolution. People are now starting to frantically cargo cult as much as they humanly can from what they see at conference talks, bus advertisements, who knows where they're seeing it all. But they're starting to twist a sort of a technology that is aimed at solving political and cultural problems and trying to use it in ways that are inappropriate. You can build a fantastic torque wrench, doesn't help you pound the nail in any more effectively unless you hold it very wrong. So part of what I've been evangelizing for the past, let's call it 6 months or so, is an understanding of the problem you're trying to solve. From my perspective, if you go back in time far enough, where the microservices idea came from is you have 500 engineers all working on a monolith. Everyone's stepping on each other's toes. They're very rapidly getting to a place where they're not able to ship code effectively. And basically you wind up with the old saw of a group of whales is called a pod, a group of pros is called a murder, and a group of developers is called a merge conflict. The idea that you can break that down into different groups where small teams can work on them, that becomes a lot more usable for something like that. Counterpoint, you have a startup with 3 developers and 200 microservices. You haven't really solved anything. You've just created a whole new category of problem for yourself. So like anything, you can take good ideas and exploit them to the point where the premises upon which they're based are no longer directly applicable. So I guess the takeaway from all this is be intentional. I try and wrap that in a bunch of witty aphorisms. And
be intentional. How does be intentional? Oh, hey, cat. Oh, God. The cat just stepped on the keyboard. Sorry. That's live streaming for you.
Look at dogs. They eat the keyboard instead.
So that affects the human factor immensely, doesn't it? I mean, in terms of how you think about, how you're really thinking about the approach you take.
No, absolutely. I think that a lot of times people are doing things because it seems to make sense. They saw it in a conference talk. Something wound up in the good part of the Gartner Magic Quadrant. Mm-hmm. Someone read something in the In-Flight magazine. I don't know, maybe they saw the Backstreet Boys doing it on television or something. But they wind up effectively trying to map a global solution that's aimed at a very specific set of problems, and they aren't focusing on what their problems look like.
I guess I guess I missed that microservices show by the Backstreet Boys. I'll have to look at my archives.
Yeah. I was mostly into country music at that point. You don't want to know how that ended up.
So, what are some of the issues that arise? And David, maybe you'd like to pitch in here a little bit. These DevOps practices that are becoming so important are still, conceptual in many ways, but they do relate directly to the actual successful implementation of an architecture such as Kubernetes and using cloud-native technologies.
David, did we lose you?
David is not here. No wonder he has not been speaking up. So maybe, Corey, you could help us answer that.
Sure, why not? I think that you're starting to see people attempting to apply Kubernetes to things in ways that are, I don't want to say stupid, but picture a polite euphemism for that and we'll get there. A common example, a pattern for this, is people are jumping onto Kubernetes to solve the idea of, how do we go multi-cloud? How do we take what we've got and deploy this to multiple cloud providers for the same workload on an ongoing basis? In theory, it sounds awesome. In practice, you are creating tremendous amounts of work and toil for yourself. If you're trying to deploy, for example, to GCP and AWS at the same time with the same workload, you're limited to the platform primitives that exist between both of those, which more or less distills down to compute, disk, maybe a load balancer, hopefully a managed database service somewhere. By giving up a lot of the very specific, evolved, higher-level services on both platforms, you're having to reinvent a lot of stuff yourself. And while the idea from the olden days of avoiding vendor lock-in is a good one, there's merit to that, trying to maintain that in a sort of half-baked way doesn't work in a modern context. It slows you down. You're trading feature velocity for an option on a strategy you're very unlikely to leverage in the near term.
So how do you see that, where that feature velocity gets slowed down and it kind of defeats the purpose of the whole exercise in itself?
When you're doing a deployment of a piece of software and you want to, come up with a reasonable way of making that viewable to people who have authenticated against your application in a safe and sane way, you have a couple of options. You can wind up using something on AWS like Cognito User Pool to handle authentication, and that goes really well. You can also use the GCP equivalent, but those two generally don't speak the same language. So if you're going to get away from that, congratulations. You now get to build your entire user authentication system yourself, rather than using the click button receive user management. that's a somewhat basic example, but it tends to tie into a model where, okay, if you're not going to take advantage of this service that's already been built for you and instead build your own, you're doing what people call undifferentiated heavy lifting. The idea that your business objective is generally not to create user authentication systems. It's to do whatever it is your product or service your company provides. And that in turn manifests itself as companies focusing on the wrong thing. I had a tweet that did reasonably well a while back. Our company sells socks, so maybe building a bespoke container management system shouldn't be in our top 5 strategic priorities. It's the sort of thing where people try to focus on the wrong part of the story without a clear and concise understanding of what their business is.
Well, sock puppets, that'd be another story.
That's a whole separate problem. Sock puppets, astroturfing, all of it. Oh yeah.
Well, that leads to lots and lots of questions, because Kubernetes is pretty pretty complex architecture. You know, its core is continually getting updated. What?
I'm sorry, one of us cut out. I think it was me. My apologies. Repeat that.
Oh, well, that gets to some questions, because the Kubernetes core is quite complex, right? We know that. I mean, it's like a hive. And how do you think about, you know, that human factor when you're trying to like get up to pace with an orchestration environment that really demands that frictionless capability? It requires, you know, to really get the use out of it to be continuous in terms of the delivery.
Oh, absolutely. It requires entirely new ways of thinking. I mean, this is one of the primary reasons that I advise ReactiveOps, not just because really works when I make fun of them, but instead because they tend to have the right approach to a lot of this. The idea being, I mean, just a continuation of what I've been saying, where focus on the core competencies of what your company does. Generally speaking, wrapping your head around the care and feeding and deployment of a complex, containerized, microservices-based environment is, first off, something there aren't a whole lot of people out there on the market today who are competent and capable in that sphere, as well as it's not what your company is setting out to do in most cases. It's to sell widgets or service widgets. Right. So bringing someone who knows where the sharks are hiding and how to at least get you through that transitional phase adds stupendous value. And I think that it also helps separate out, biases that creep up inside of a company. Okay, you know your environment and you've seen how it works reasonably well. Terrific. But specialists in this have dozens of those stories. They have a broader observer perspective where they see how things are manifesting and playing out in multiple environments simultaneously. It starts to bring in shared learnings from other places in a safe and confined way. And it helps develop expertise internally. In every engagement for something like this, it's at least half education more than just doing work. It comes down to looking at what's being done, looking at what the processes are, and tools, especially relatively unopinionated tools. I think I would classify Kubernetes that way. There are multiple ways to roll out an implementation, and it makes sense to do that in ways that are beneficial to what currently exists politically, culturally, and aligned what your business does and how it works.
Sure. So when it comes down to the tools themselves, people use a variety of, you know, of services, but it just seems to me the thing you hear from like the people who kind of are thinking in the room quite deeply about how the core infrastructure works, they've been involved in the architecture of it for a very long time. Their goal, their real, you know, sign of success is absolute boredom. Right? And let's make this thing as boring as possible. And my question is, yeah, that's a question of like how well you can actually use the compute, storage, and networking out there, right? How well you can effectively use those resources. But the tools haven't quite caught up quite yet. I mean, and the practices are still pretty standard, aren't they? I mean, people will use Jenkins for a long, long time, and they'll probably use it in conjunction with some continuous delivery platform. But the way they're using it now is a much different approach based upon their pre-qualification for being there in many respects. They learned Jenkins when it was new.
I think you're going to see that pattern continue to persist, and we have for a long time. You take a look at reInvent, AWS's big annual conference. People get on stage and release new products and offerings around machine learning, about higher level AI features, about these really clever new services that launch. But if you take a look from a global observer perspective, 85% of Amazon spend is on EC2, S3, RDS, and a couple of other services. But that's boring stuff. Oh, a VM that you run somewhere. We know how to manage that. No one gives conference talks about it because it's understood and everyone knows how to do it. Not true, but we'll get there. Instead, what you see is people talking about interesting, exciting, and neat architectures. And that's great for some companies who are pushing the bleeding edge. But an awful lot of companies out there do things that are not exciting and hip. They do things like make sure the traffic lights work and make sure the ATM displays the right balance. You generally don't want a lot of those workloads focusing on bleeding edge technologies that haven't been proven out. You're right, the tooling is still evolving and best practices are still evolving. And if this were an understood area that was largely settled, you wouldn't have me on to talk about this at all. We'd be screaming about something else.
So how do you address that as a human factor when considering continuous delivery, if that is something that's a business objective?
Mm-hmm. The first step is to figure out if it is continuous delivery something that adds value to what you're doing?
Okay, so
is it something you've read about or saw on a conference stage somewhere?
So let's say there is a need for it. Let's say that maybe you have a use case for where it really is true, right? Or a case study, for example. For example, maybe they're a use case for a company that has developed an application that needs to be continuously updated because now it's being deployed to not just the insurance agents, but tens of thousands of customers of those agents around a region or something like that, and it has to work. Sure. It has to work, right? So that's kind of an example, and I think we're going to see more companies getting to that point where they're going to require that kind of that performance and that optimization. So there must be examples that you guys have come across in your work that kind of tell that story and tell some of the past people have found, but then the issues that they found along the way as well.
Absolutely, and this is where it gets interesting, and this is why I'm working with ReactiveOps, a service company, rather than a product company. I can pull out a whiteboard and draw out an architecture that solves all the problems you described. Here's how you achieve continuous delivery, blueprint deploys, here's how we wind up doing rollbacks, here's how you wind up canary testing to make sure everything is great. And that's not a hard problem. There are countless examples of this.
Well, I know you could present that. I could present that. I'm wondering what the experiences are of those people who you're having conversations with.
And the answer is it depends.
Okay, of course it depends. Always depends. But there has to be the patterns that you're starting to see establish.
Yes, and that's the number one pattern I'm seeing, is that the missing piece that no one really takes into account in conferenceware is where are people starting from? The question is not what does the end state look like? That is a relatively finite set of solutions.
Right.
It's here's where you are. How do you get to where you're going? In the case of your insurance company that things have to work for 10,000 clients, you can't just turn it off for 6 weeks to do a migration. In most companies, you can't hit pause on feature releases. So you're trying to hit a moving target. The analogy becomes, how do you rebuild a car from scratch while hurtling down the freeway at 60 miles an hour? 70, let's be honest here. That's how I drive. But the challenge there is in finding an answer that makes sense. In some cases, you do have to make architectural sacrifices. I mean, yes, it's easy to sit here and say, 10 years ago, we made dumb decisions and should have done it differently. Yeah, but you got to this point 10 years later where you're still a going concern. You still intend to be to the point where you're rolling things out. The interesting pieces for me in the areas that I get involved in are less technical. It's not about the nuts and bolts and the code that generates these things. It's about the business process. It's, as you say, to the human factors that wind up assuring success or failure. A lot of times, when you're talking to a prospect early on in the conversation, there isn't a clear win for moving in this direction. And as interesting and fun as it would be to sit there and take people's money to solve a problem they don't really have, that's not doing them any favors. So very often it's, what you have works and you don't have a problem for which this is a good fit. Validating that there is actual value in here is something that a lot of people gloss over. Like, yeah, it's great. Okay, there needs to be a value. Now, once it gets moving, what are we going to do? Well, back up. You're jumping to a conclusion that hasn't been borne out yet. Now, as far as the actual migration process goes, there's a whole bunch of sharp edges that go along the way, depending upon what constraints are. Okay, you can do continuous delivery, instant rollback, terrific. That's awesome. The capability is there technically, and let's even say that we can break apart the monolith in a way that gets you there rapidly for some of the other workloads. You're still seeing a number of challenges emerge, often with cultural problems, process problems, regulatory concerns. Oh, great, we can press a button and roll something out, press a button, a different button, and it rolls back. There need to be 7 levels of audit sign-off for each one of those buttons to get pressed. So a lot of that turns into how do we automate those approvals in a responsible, reasonable way?
So in talking to all those people,
yes,
how are you starting to view like the evolution of application infrastructure? You have a broad perspective of discussions with people.
Mm-hmm. I think that there's a marked difference in how people are building software today versus how they were 5 years ago. It's to a point now where you tell someone to draw out their software architecture on a whiteboard. And with little more than that, you can usually get a pretty good idea of how old their company is. When it's almost like it's going back in time. And we've seen this before. In cloud environments, if you're not taking advantage of VPCs, you're probably from 2008 or so. You're playing with containers a lot, it's probably 2013, 2014. Everything's done in serverless, well, it probably means you started this morning, and so on and so forth. Things almost get frozen in amber to a certain point. A lot of times what you do see in this migration process is when people start breaking apart a monolith, it's not, we're not going to roll out 600 microservices. Let's pick pieces off of it. And those pieces are represented in test workloads. They tend to have a couple of things in common. They're either relatively decoupled as far as the rest of the monolith is concerned, so you could test things out, or they're incredibly painful in that they tend to be, every change there breaks 5 other things. So isolating out the dependency diagram, understanding what it is exactly, because that section requires inputs and outputs, and then safely managing that off into something that can be a responsible microservice can often provide a huge win. On the other side of the migration process, there are things with long tails that are built in. Certain workloads are very challenging to break into this pattern, are very difficult to move out of data centers in some cases. And what a lot of companies will do is they'll get 3/4 of the way through a cloud migration, realize that, okay, that last bit is going to be really expensive and not worth doing potentially. We're now going to plant a flag, call it a hybrid, declare victory, and go work on something else. I do believe that's where a lot of multi-cloud or hybrid infrastructures come from. That you get to a point of diminishing returns and, we're just going to call it good and refocus on something else. That's cynical, but I don't think it's an unheard of pattern.
So how is Kubernetes a game changer?
While I'm continuing that theme of cynicism, I would argue it's a game changer in that what if we could redo OpenStack again and not make the same series of terrible decisions?
This is Kubernetes. That's Kubernetes. That's Kubernetes, and that's Kubernetes. Then is it OpenStack without what happened to it during its course of evolution?
Exactly. I would argue it's a different disaster story. Yes. I mean, again, I'm being cynical here, but there's changes as a result of lessons learned from other projects that are tying into the governance model, that are tied into where it's going. And something that I think makes Kubernetes a different story than OpenStack was by a landslide is every major provider is now supporting Kubernetes. Some had to be dragged into it kicking and screaming. Others were there right at the very beginning. But it's turning into I would call it an open standard in a way that few things have been before. And that alone begins to open up a lot of opportunity. You're no longer having dueling orchestration stories. You don't see, for example, Docker Swarm now saying, nope, Kubernetes is not the way. That is being looped in as well. So you wind up with people able to focus on at least a common interchange format of what containers look like and what scheduling them appears to be. That is driving an entire generation of applications that take advantage of these primitives, that are able to build out software applications that can speak this language natively. I think we're seeing a lot of migration projects that are still struggling to get there, but a lot of greenfield things are doing this extremely well. And getting there and watching how this evolves is terrific. Because we're seeing some of the early and mid-cycle adoption curve take off, and that's great, which is going to inform the larger, slow-moving blue-chip style companies that, despite what lies they tell themselves internally, are not primarily technology companies. Technology has been a means to an end, not the end in itself. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that.
No, there's not. Well, this has really been interesting. I mean, I was actually kind of like looking through the chapter that you guys wrote, and one of the things that that you guys write about is about simplified service discovery. And when you talk about breaking down the monolith, that just seems like a fundamental thing that has to happen. Is that an evolutionary, is that accurately, do you think, in terms of the evolution of what we're seeing here?
I think that when you wind up looking at what Kubernetes offers and how to write these things, I think that the answer is a spectrum. You can, and to narrow it down very specifically, take a look at what containers people are running. You can have containers that run a single process and that's it.
Right.
Whenever that process terminates, things end.
Right.
The other side of the spectrum, you have people shoving entire operating system images inside of a container, and they're leveraging that as a deploy. I've seen
not exactly a best practice, but right, but
absolutely not.
But that's the way they do it. But that's the way they do it. That's the user space, right?
It's also not a terrible first approach to these things. And the easy thing to do is sit here and you're making the same mistakes that the ancient did 18 months ago. That's not helpful. It's not constructive.
Hey, I'll tell you, man, the first time I made a podcast, talk about like a learning experience, it's everything. It's the same way with something where you just got to do it.
Oh, absolutely. The best way to be good at something is to be really crappy at it first. And you learn the lessons. Yeah. Part of the value of bringing in experts in an arena is they know where the sharp edges are. Yeah. Don't do this, or this, and you'll have a much better time.
Yeah.
And I guess firms that are willing to see it can learn those things. You also do have stubborn companies that are, all these other companies tried the same thing and they all failed. The answer must be that they're stupid and we are awesome, so we're going to do it and succeed. And they don't put it in those kinds of terms, but how many times have you seen that hubris evolve and watch companies wind up going completely sideways on this? Simon Wardley is a keen observer of this particular mentality, where companies fail to understand the strategy behind what they're doing because there generally isn't one. They're deluded into thinking that they are best at this, and their vision of the world comports with what everyone else sees. And experience has shown it's just not true.
So they have a lack of vision, or they have a lack of strategy?
I would call it a lack of awareness. And I'd say it's probably all of the above and more. I think it's a lack of a clear idea of both where they want to go and where they are. It's sort of the not invented here syndrome that manifests in a different way. You see this with employees too, where employees at a company get stuck on the internal promotion path of how do I get to the next level? How do I get to the next pay bump? And lose sight of the fact that if they change companies, look at a 30% raise, and who cares what your job title is necessarily? It's not a It's the same level of institutionalization where companies of a certain scale and size have lost sight of the greater path, of where the vision is and what they're there for in the first place. When people's entire strategy discussion devolves into what if Amazon does a thing that competes with what we do, great, it's a concern and something to at least be aware of. But if all you're selling is this fear, uncertainty, and doubt of what could happen or might happen, and not understanding what you're doing today and what is happening and has happened, then it turns into a sky is falling story. I don't find that viable, and you see too much of that in microservices architecture these days, if you're asking me my personal opinion. To be clear, a lot of this is my personal opinion.
That's great.
Not that of
no,
ReactiveOps,
I think, just in conclusion, we're coming up to the end of the half hour here, and, I'm curious about kind of new things that you're watching and you're seeing out there that, that I'm sure will be some things that ReactiveOps is considering thinking about. I mean, we're hearing a lot of kind of this intersection of Git and operations, for example, and Rob Scott talks about it in the chapter here as a premise for thinking about managing, Kubernetes. Is that of interest to you, or are there other topics that are more of interest to you now that in your conversations you're having on the road and with folks along the way?
I've been an advocate for the idea that Git is a fundamental starting point or on-ramp for DevOps, microservices, Kubernetes, all of it for a long time. When I learned Git in 2008, it was transformative. I went to a training that some folks from GitHub put on to teach me all about Git. I was coming from a Subversion background, and it was enlightening. They go out there, they explain how it works, and I sit there and, oh, wow, I never thought of it this way. I'm stupid. Why didn't anyone ever tell me? And it was rough back then, learning how this stuff worked. And Git got easier to understand, a lot more user-friendly. The trainings got a lot better. But also, people have learned to think in slightly different ways. The idea of consistent snapshots of what things look like at a point in time that you can then go back to, that you can then take, you can port that, you can branch that over to something else to work with, is incredibly valuable. I think that one of the best descriptions of Docker that I heard early on was, picture Git for an entire file system, and you're not far from wrong. And that sort of clicked for a lot of people, because after they've already had their brain broken by Git the first time, the second time is not nearly as difficult, not as ossified as you might expect.
Right.
So there's a very, I think, keen relationship between Git principles and concepts, if not the Git software itself, and what you're trying to achieve here. Versus the old school way. I mean, when I started my career, you would go down to the data center and touch physical servers and make changes live in production and hope for the best. And your DR plan was making sure your resume had been recently updated. We have more responsibility, more rigor, more approach to these things that are the right way to move forward.
And I think what I would do is I just add on the fact I think there's still people like that who are still working in those operations. And there's people who are thinking about Git in their operations, and there too someday maybe the paths will cross.
Meanwhile, there's some Solaris admins somewhere in a data center right now looking up from the rack they're working on saying, I feel personally attacked right now. Yeah, pretty much.
All right, Corey, this has been a lot of fun. Thank you so much for your time. This has been a fantastic conversation. It's challenged me to think a little bit more different context, so thank you for that, and I hope you've enjoyed your time on our show.
Very much so. Thank you for your time.
Thanks. All right. I should probably turn off the stream. Bye, baby.